So guys, I very recently just redesigned the cover art for Phone Numbers by Dominic, Fike and Kenny Beats. And I wanted to walk you through a few of the design decisions as well as techniques that I've used along the way. Now it won't be a one-to-one replica because this was a lot of experimentation and trial and error, but it will be a general idea of how I've gone from A to B. So let's jump straight into Photoshop. So guys, here is the final redesign that I created for this Phone Numbers cover. Going into this, I had a few main objectives. I wanted to create something that was completely different from the original cover art, which I will put up here, which is simply just an image of clouds with this kind of like red Phone Numbers stamp pasted on top of it. I think personally that cover represents the song really well, and I wanted to create something that was in a completely different vein that, if anything, doesn't represent it at all. Now, this kind of style and aesthetic that I've gone for is heavily inspired by Dan Barkle on Instagram, which I'll again put up here. Now, he makes this kind of insane abstract grunge work that I will sit and look at and wonder how he's even done it. So I took the song I was listening to, fired it straight into a cover. So I'm going to walk you through the layers of this design, and then I can briefly bring you into another document just to show you any specifics that I think can be helpful. So the first step we're going to take is I'm going to strip all of the layers down, and it's just going to give you a bit more insight into what's gone into something like this. So as I pull away all of these layers, I think the whole subject will become a lot clearer as you see everything in pieces. So down to nothing. I've now got my final design just in one folder, just so we can keep going back to this as a reference, right? So within this, there's a few main elements and a few kind of hidden details that I wanted to link in with the theme of the song. So the song is called Phone Numbers. There's a heavy influence on this. So I wanted to bring in some key features of the lyrics that could actually be represented visually and kind of help. So the main focus I went for was dialing codes, and you can see here, these are two dialing codes. I believe one is from Florida and one is from Massachusetts. And these are the two places that Dominic, Fike and Kenny Beats are from. So that's kind of just like a subtle aspect of just adding in something to fill in with the theme. As well as this, you can see this kind of like abstract grid I've got pasted behind here. It's a table of dialing codes from different states in the US. So it's these kind of like small details that can really make a composition work, because when everything kind of makes sense, it fits into place a lot more naturally. So I'm going to show you just a simple formatting of how I've done this. So I'm just on the Wikipedia page for a list of telephone country codes, and I see this graph, and immediately I thought, okay, right, how can I extract this information and put this into a visual? But without thinking any further than that, I thought the graph by itself is an interesting visual and can represent this, because it doesn't need to be readable. Realistically, no one's going to read all of this information. So I've taken a screenshot, as I'm going to do just there, and then I can drag this into Photoshop. Now I'll just repeat what I've done on my other document in this step. So I knew that with this design, I wanted to create it in this kind of like quite monotone color scheme, just using like black, white, gray, and then use orange as a tertiary color, kind of like an accent color. So I wanted to just strip this of any saturation and turn this into somewhat of more of an abstract, ink bleedy, gritty piece. So with that graph, I've got this layer just here, and you can see it's got a whole bunch of masking on it now because it's within a folder that has some brush mask on. So if I remove that, I remove this mask, strip down these layer effects, these smart filters, and you can see that it's just this graph. Now what I've done is I've come into blending modes and I've just adjusted the opacity, right? So we can strip the white down and kind of take a bit of the opacity away. Now this is going to help it kind of blend in with the other assets in the background and help with layering. So now from here, I've added a few smart filters. I've gone into the blur gallery and I've added a fill blur, and you can see I've got a whole bunch of different points where I've just adjusted the blur values. Now whenever you tie in a fill blur with a threshold effect, it creates a very interesting visual. So you can see here, this looks a lot more like it's created using analog techniques, and I thought this was perfect to fit in with the theme. So yeah, I added just another Gaussian blur just to, in general, just create a bit of texture and make it a bit more like kind of curved and rounded, as well as a diffuse to give it this distressed outline. You can see the difference it makes on this kind of area here, which gives a bit more texture to it. Now I can hold that image within a folder. I can use a texture brush to then create this kind of distressed look, makes it really inconsistent and unpolished. So then I use a gradient map just to tone these down into a bit more of a subtle grey. Then after the gradient map, I wanted to retain some of the original aspects from the cover, so I wanted to continue using the cloud image. So I've added in our background clouds here, and now this threshold layer I do not need. I've just got a gradient map. I've used the same two colours from our original gradient map just here, placed them over this cloud image, and immediately it's creating this really nice kind of like faint grey texture going across the whole design. Now you can see already this is kind of starting to shape a composition. We've got 2/3 of the design on the left hand side in columns like taken up, and now this is kind of coming along just above the halfway point. We've got a clear passage here to put in some sort of text element, and then we've got some faint contrast up here which could include another image, which is kind of the way that I've gone about constructing this. As well as this, I needed to include the actual title name and the artist name, so I've left a small gap, kind of a small strip along the bottom where I can add the text in, and you can see that I've done this here. Now with this text, it's the same kind of texturing elements I've used. I've used diffuse, on filter, stylize, diffuse. Now this is just going to really rough the edges. As well as that, I've got my standard displacement maps I use with film dust textures, which I'll link in the description below. And then I've used a texture brush, which I'll show you here. I've got this kind of paint splat textured brush, which is randomized every time you click it. So if I'm going to set it to black to hide it, you can see as I click and drag, it creates this textured masking that's amazing for creating these kind of elements. So now with this, I can just change the size of it. I can click and just make it subtle, can do it how I want, or I can click and drag for it to be a bit thicker. Now this gives you so many options with like custom texturing and making it, fine-tuning it to exactly how you want it to be. Now I've done this across effectively every layer in this piece. This is kind of how the texture's been constructed, especially with this top splat folder you can see here. So this is just kind of creating that contrast and kind of playing into the structure and composition of the piece. And it really adds well when you've got these texture overlays and just creates a bit more depth, I think, between the layers. It makes the layers really stand out individually. In the actual method of creating this, I have gone into the top corner of my design and just held down my click. I'll show you how I've done it. So I create a new layer here using that same brush, which again, I'll link in the description below. I'm gonna get a black brush and I'm just gonna hold this down. Now it's just gonna randomly fill in these kind of splats, but because I'm doing it in the corner, obviously there is a limit on the edge. From this point, you can just take the layer, drag it across, and it's just gonna kind of create separation between layers. And a good thing with this is you can play around with the placement of this and you can find some really interesting options to kind of help your layout. You know, add some rotations, rotate it the other way, do some flips, maybe even do some warping, and you can just move it around and play around. So now with this, I'm keeping all of the elements in this kind of like faint gray color scheme. I've repeated the same kind of step here with a left splat. I've got a really faint gray just so it's a little bit less visible, and I've gone for a larger splat. So what I've done is just increase the size of this brush here, reset my colors, and I can just drag one of them slightly down into gray, make sure that one's selected, and then just click. It's going to create these inconsistent splats, but it's just creating texture the whole way across. It's just, again, just adding to that layering. Now from here, I was considering adding in either the title next or the image. I will work in the title just to show you. So I've got my title layer here. Now a lot of this is textured with masks and the same brush pack that, again, I'll link in the description. You're going to see it. It's got this halftone brush which I've used to create this texture on the text. So to start with, I've just added in my type. Now I don't believe I have the original type layer, but I will show you. I've been using Owner's Extra Wide, set this to some sort of gray, and I've just set my tracking back to 0. Now, if I was to add in the, let's say, +1, I don't know what the numbers were, but let's say it's this. Again, I'm just, for considering kind of placement and layout, I'm just zooming out and seeing what fits where. I can add in some nice, you can see it visibly, there's a lot of nice contrast. You know, you're not struggling to read it. If I have it there, obviously it's not going to be readable because it's behind the darker color. So I want it in this kind of like heavy white area. So in terms of placement, this lower right portion just looks perfect to do it. Now, I could add in another number just directly below it, increase or decrease the leading, but it's not really fulfilling it for me. So I thought, again, with contrast, there's this dark zone here. So let me just use my tab indent and kind of bring it across a bit. Now this is going to help with, you know, add a little bit of kind of uniqueness to the layout as well as readability. You're going to be able to read this from a distance. So yeah, from that point, I've just used my displacement map, which is going to roughen the edges here. So I've been using my film dust displacement map, which if you guys have seen my recent videos, I've been using it loads. And then with this, what you can do, create a layer mask on your text layer. So if I use it for this one, I'm going to create a layer mask. And now I'm going to go into my brush sets and I'm going to scroll down and I've got this halftone brush, which I'm going to see just here. With this, I can then just click and drag over all of the text and it's going to create this halftone pattern here. Now, this is obviously doable with brushes, but you can do this in the filter gallery as well. You could go onto your layer, filter gallery. You can come into sketch here and you're going to see halftone pattern. You can create that yourself just using some colors and sorting out the pattern type. This brush for me was definitely the easier option in terms of texturing. And then what I've done is added this texture layer within another folder. And then with that, I can create a layer mask on my folder and I can just click and drag over this text. Now, you don't have to do this the whole way over because it already is a textured element. But what you can do is maybe bring the size down a bit, do it over certain areas of certain letters, certain numbers. Just click and drag around some edges. Just try and make it as inconsistent as you can. That's what's going to make it look really genuine and analog and kind of hand printed. So there we go, just add in a few elements there and it's already starting to visually tie into the whole composition rather than just being a simple block of text like this. So now the difference is crazy. From here, I've just added a gradient map overlay, just tying it in with those same colors we've been using before. Now for these ones, I wanted to make it slightly darker to bring, you know, really influence that layering again and make it visible, have some good contrast. So on the gradient map, simply just use a slightly darker hex code on the gray. So now guys, just to bring in this image of Dominic Fike here, I'm going to walk you through the steps I've taken to create this. So now, hiding this original, we're going to come down to our folder here with the image in, and I'm just going to add this image here. Now, this has already got a Gaussian blur applied. Now, the reason I've done this is so that when this all becomes textured together, these edges are slightly softer. They're not going to be a harsh edge, which is going to ruin the texture completely, so I wanted to keep it soft and blended. So now with this image, I've sourced from Google as so. So this is quite a high resolution one, so what I've done is come onto images, tools, size, make sure that large is selected, and it's going to only filter for higher quality images. So save that, drag that in, and then from here I'm just considering the kind of image size. The actual composition of the image is perfect, just having a center aligned face and in this portrait layer. So it fits perfectly in this kind of upper left zone, and I thought I want it layered in with the rest of the design, so I've dragged the folder underneath our graph folder just so we can get some of those overlaying elements and texture. So the first step was to add a threshold layer. Now this was just going to isolate this into black and white, and it was going to give me a little bit of a better idea of how I can blend this within a texture. So I played around with the threshold value, just kind of placed it where I wanted it, and then my second step for that was to overlay it with a grunge texture. So I've sourced this grunge texture online. I've gone on to texture fabric grunge. Now if you type this in, these guys have some really high quality, high resolution grunge textures. So just this one here. So I'm going to show you this here. With this layer mode on normal, this is the texture. I've then simply just sized it, dragged it over the image, and now this is the point where I'm going to play around with layer modes and get the kind of exclusion pattern to blend his face into the texture. So I've come down here and I've selected this onto subtract. And now back on the image, we're going to play around with the same layer modes for this, and you're going to see as I cycle through these, you're going to get a few options that are going to kind of pull out different details within the face. So for this one, let's say subtract, maybe we go back onto the original, try one of the divides, so subtract for that one, maybe divide for this one, and you have to play with trial and error and just get it to kind of isolate parts of the face into the design. So here's an example. This is retaining all of the texture, but it's just showing you the assets of the actual figure themselves, so it's easy to see. So now from this point, I'd add in a gradient map to apply over this, which I've just done white to orange. Now the reason I've done white to orange is so that it creates this blending here. So now it blends in with the exact background color that we're using already. And now with this gradient map applied, come back to the layer modes and you can just test these around and you will find a balance that works well. It's going to reveal parts of the texture as well as showing you the face. Here we go. There we go. So this is what we're looking for just here. So now we've got a clear grunge texture element with these soft edges because of that Gaussian blur, and you've got aspects of his face being revealed through the texture, so it's just blending perfectly. Now, I've just realized I overlooked one of the earlier features, which was the plus sign grid pattern, which kind of creates the structure across the whole cover. So in order to do this, what I did was create a simple text box. So I've just clicked and dragged over the kind of like margin width of the cover, and I've just typed in the plus icon. Now, if you repeatedly copy and paste this, you're going to fill this out very fast. And you could individually create the cross shapes using the line tool, but this is just so much quicker, as well as evenly spaced, and just makes a lot more sense to do this. So just using those kind of like center align tools here, it's just created this simple grid pattern. So now from this point, I would just change around the layer modes, and one of them I would put either on one of these kind of like excluding layer modes of these four here. So for example, let's say put it on exclusion, then I create a duplicate. I'm going to drag it into the folder here that has these distressed mask on it. So I've been using that texture brush to create these distressed features. So you're going to see here, it creates these imperfections all over the grid and just blends it in really well with the texture that's already there, as well as mimicking the color because it's on the gradient map and the threshold. This is a good thing about creating folders and applying the layers to the folders because you can drag in elements as you add them. It's going to help you a lot with blending. So with this, I've got this layer and I'm going to create a copy and drag it up above. You can see I've got my original one here already. Now from this point, I want to put this onto divide. Now this is going to create these white crosses within the darker areas. And if you just shift it 1 pixel, it adds a little bit of depth. You see, it almost looks like a 3D element here because they all have their kind of individual drop shadow. So you can move these a few pixels around, you can see what you want, but you can play around with these and you can see what works for you. You can get options that are a lot more faint, you know, that kind of blend in a little bit better, but this is all just personal preference. So if I select mine on color here, I can even then just turn the opacity down, maybe put it to 50%, and then for the original, do the same kind of step. Just experiment with them, see what kind of opacity you're looking for and what sticks out for you, and then go from there. Now, with all the primary elements in, it's just a case of texturing now. And there was, I believe, one more kind of splat folder to add in, which is this one here. So repeating those same steps, just get your splat brush, do it against the edge of the canvas, and then you can shrink in the size and play around with the placement and get it to where you want it. So I've done that and just made it a slightly lighter gray, just using a color overlay. Now this again, when it comes to recoloring, is going to give a lot more depth and texture to the color. You can have a bit of a wider range rather than just, you know, gray and white. So now I wanted to add a few just simple noise layers, which I did using the camera raw filter. So I've just added 2 of these and I've set one of them to soft light on opacity 100 and set one of them to hard light on a lower opacity. So now as I zoom in and I hide and reveal these, it's going to give a good combination of grain. So the soft light one applies really well to the darker colors and the hard light is a bit more of a broader, thicker apply or application to the lighter colors. So now with those both added, I then wanted to create a combined layer with all of my current layers. So I'm going to use Command Option Shift and E, and now I've got this layer here which is produced, which is going to be all of these layers combined. I'm then going to make sure that this is a smart object, and what I've done is come up to the filter gallery and I've used the canvas texturizer. Now this is amazing because it doesn't impact color, which a lot of the filter gallery effects do. So it maintains all of this orange and it creates this uniform texture across the whole piece, which kind of ties it into this kind of analog look. So I've just used a really low relief and a really low scaling. So if I set this to 100, it's a lot more prominent and you can see the lines a little bit more distinct. So I'm going to set this down to about 60 and keep the relief where it is and make sure the texture here is set on canvas. So now when I press OK, really clean, kind of like unpolished, uniform texture. Now this is really working in with the grunge effect, which I love. And then creating the design in this color, I always have the need at the end of my designs to kind of play around with gradient maps and see if there's any colorways that I prefer, which I did in this case. So I'll show you. I have grabbed this gradient map just here, which effectively is just being black and white, and I've just reversed it. And now the reason that it's not applying onto the orange, you'd think if you add a black and white one, for example, if I set this on normal, you know, it's going to look like this. But I've set it to hard light, and that's just going to apply to the kind of like high ends and dark ends. So we've got the white and the blacks being applied to here, and the orange is almost completely ignored. It does slightly change the hue of it, which I quite like because obviously it blends in with the kind of like faintness of the colors. And then, yeah, so with this gray, I've then just added in another curves layer just to kind of adjust the highs and lows. So you see it up here, I've just dragged in this dark end a bit and then slightly increased the curve of the whites, just so it's a bit more of a gray range coming through. And that's effectively it on this design. I think if I was to redo it now, what I would do with this image here of Dom, I would come into it and I would put an inverse on it so that the orange is applied to his face. You know what I mean? So the orange is coming onto the light area highlights of his face. And then I can play around with the threshold, which is going to rebalance it and kind of like hide and reveal more features. So I think something like this would have been cool. Maybe what I'd even do is kind of create another threshold layer and clip that, set this one to a different value. So then when I master the original of this one, you're going to get some more orange detail coming around the edges. And then I can use that texture brush as I was doing before, and it's just going to create this imperfect kind of mask that's going to show this image. So yeah, I think that's what I would do if I was to redo it. I've just done a really brief idea here. I would polish that up a lot more. But yeah, for the final design, this is just a general walkthrough of the steps I've used, and I hope that this can be useful to you. Now guys, as always, I appreciate you making it to the end of the video, and I hope that you can learn something and add a new technique to your set of skills. Now, if you want to see more content from me, I've got a whole bunch of other videos on the channel. YouTube's going to recommend you one just here. So go ahead and watch that, and I'll see you over there.